that. Everyone be sure to check that out.
Some
If you're in the
damn
middle of your
shit.
process and need some help, definitely join that Discord. But for today's topic,
Street whore.
let's talk about Jesus. Let's talk about supposedly how he is or is not the Messiah. And I know that especially in Western Christianity, those who are somewhat undereducated, your average typical Christian who just goes through and on Mother's Knee they learn about Christ, they don't understand the history of what the Jews believe or the history of the Old Testament. Welcome to Mindshift. I'm Brandon, and I have a wonderful guest today. Maybe one of the most requested guests over the last few months. This is Justin from Deconstruction Zone. Justin, a quick welcome.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Brandon. I've been a fan of your channel for quite some time, actually, since you first started streaming. And I always thought to myself, man, I'd love to collaborate with this fantastic mind.
I hate this. I'm going to make myself
We made it happen,
anyways.
man. Thank you very much. Mutually a fan. Very excited for today's conversation as well. For those of you that don't know Justin, he has an amazing channel, The Deconstruction Zone, where the main thing, at least what I love the most, although you have some side videos and you have your own conversations, but your live streams with people calling in, watching you walk people through. You know, I saw a comment on one of yours the other day that was like, hey, Justin's playing chess, he's 5 moves ahead. And not in a combative way, necessarily, but you know where you want it to go, you know the point you're trying to make. Of course, you know what the believer is going to point to. And just watching you walk them through that to get to the end result, which, of course, doesn't always turn out well for them, or about what our mind was doing and how vague prophecy was and how easy it is to retcon these things. I was like, okay, got it, it's just false. But somewhere pretty late into everything, it was raised to me, I don't remember where I read it or saw it, that, you know, Jesus just does not fit this mold well. And it's something that I had not personally deconstructed myself. And so I thought, you know what, let's make a video about it. I was going to put it together, and I thought, no, let me get an expert. And you were the first person I thought of based off everything you cover so much. I know prophecy is one of the things you love speaking about the most. So that's why you're here. That's the topic we're going to cover. I'm really excited to dive in. But before we do, I just wanted to say, everyone, please go check out Justin on his channel. And he also has a Discord where he's actively helping people in their deconstruction, which you know is a big goal of my channel. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that Discord?
You suck.
Yeah, so it's called the Deconstruction Junction, and there's a group of us that organize it, and all of my profiles in my link tree, in my YouTube, and my TikTok, you'll find a link to join the Deconstruction Junction Discord. And the reason why this is so important is because when people start deconstructing, like when they become confronted with the idea that maybe this stuff's not all true, well, where do they go? Right? You can't just go walk into your church and blurt all this stuff out to your church members, right? You got to go talk to
them. Though many try, yeah.
So we've got a Discord for people that are actively or post-actively deconstructing, and I would encourage people to join our community. We've climbed in less than a year over 3,000 deconstructing members, and I think it's a really good resource for people who don't want to get into the debate, like they're not interested in getting onto a screen and looking silly, but they want to go somewhere and have some discussion. So I think that's a really great resource for people that are of the non-combative nature but still want to explore some of the topics.
Yeah, I love that you provide a space for both. I think that's awesome. I'm a huge fan of that. So thanks for sharing that. Everyone be sure to check that out. If you are in the middle of your process and need some help, definitely join that Discord. But for today's topic, let's talk about Jesus. Let's talk about supposedly how he is or is not the Messiah. And I know that especially in Western Christianity, those who are somewhat undereducated, your average typical Christian who just goes through and on Mother's Knee they learn about Christ, they don't understand the history of what the Jews believe or the history of the Old Testament, and all they're hearing is, hey, did you know Jesus fulfills over 300 prophecies? And they give you the statistic of the improbability of that happening just from one man, and I remember that being used with me. I remember it being impressive. I said it without knowing what exactly I was talking about. So I want to first start with, what is the Messiah, biblically speaking? Where do we get that notion? What are the actual messianic prophecies? If you could just kind of tell us what a first century Jew would have expected in terms of a Messiah and what that means.
Yeah, for sure. So I think there's like 2 slogans you might hear a Jewish person say that kind of sums up the general idea of why Jesus couldn't be the Messiah. they'll say something like no peace, no Messiah, or they'll say no king, no Messiah. And it taps into this deep root of Messiahism in the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Scriptures rather, that are suggesting like these are the hallmark signs. But if you're a Christian and you grew up reading the New Testament and you're not familiar with the Hebrew Bible, you might ask yourself, well, like why are the Jewish people so steadfast that these need to be requirements? And I think the easiest thing to do is maybe just turn to some of the more obvious Messianic scriptures, and I'll list a couple of them because we can't read all of them through the beginning to the end, but there's a couple that are really important that I think if people will just sit down and spend a little bit of time over the next couple of weeks and read a couple of these chapters, you'll have a better idea. Isaiah chapter 2 is a good start. Isaiah chapter 11 as well. I would also point the reader to Micah chapter 4 and 5. And Micah chapter 5 does come up in the New Testament. And then I would also suggest reading Ezekiel chapter 36 and 37, Jeremiah chapter 33, also Zechariah chapter 9. And then you can even see some kind of idea in the New Testament that this messianic hope for a king does really need to actually be a king, because it kind of gets mentioned in Luke chapter 1, and we'll touch a little bit on that later today. But also, if you want to ask yourself, like, well, what's going to happen when the Messiah comes? What are we expecting? Like, what are the hallmark signs? I would read Ezekiel chapter 40 all the way to the end of Ezekiel. I think these chapters give you a really good idea of, like, okay, when the Messiah does come, what are the things that should be expected, right? And we'll touch on some of those. We can't read all of those chapters, obviously, in one session. But if you're curious, those are good places to start. And, we'll be quoting from each of these chapters as we carry on. But I think in the simplest terms, when we look at even the New Testament concept of the Messiah, even the New Testament kind of had this idea that he's going to be a king. I don't know if there's much way around that. So you're probably familiar with Matthew chapter 21 when he rides the double donkeys into Jerusalem, right? And there's questions to be had about how he rode two donkeys, but I'm not sure that's the important part, right? I saw the Jean-Claude Van Damme commercial where he was, had 2 feet spread out. He could have been something like that. Who knows?
Yeah. Just surfing on 2 dolphins. Yeah.
Exactly. But the quotation is kind of a combination of 2 different quotations. But the important part is it says, "Look, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." And so, even in the New Testament, they're quoting passages that clearly indicate he's going to be a king. And if you go to Luke chapter 1, it's predicted that he's going to be a king over his people and that he's actually going to rescue them. In Luke chapter 1, verse 67 to 79, it talks about how they sent a savior for his people and that he's going to rescue them from the hands of their enemies and all who hate them, so that in doing so they can worship the Lord without fear. So even in the New Testament, we get some idea that like this expectation for a savior who's going to be a king is definitely in view. The question that we have to ask ourselves is, why are they saying these things and do they come true? And so if you don't mind, maybe I'll jump right into my favorite Messianic passage. I think it's most clearly the passage we can go to in the Old Testament that is short, it's concise, and it gives you a little idea of what the Jewish people were expecting and maybe why Jesus couldn't have fit.
Yeah, I'd love to hear it. And also, just to give some framing and context, one of the things that I had spoken about in email that I want to make sure we cover, and we'll get to it, this is a perfect place to start, but just for those of you listening, there are Old Testament verses that are indeed messianic prophecies. There are also Old Testament verses that are not about a Messiah, or specifically, of course, not about Jesus, that are brought in later through reframing, retconning, etc. We'll get to that in the second part of this conversation, I'm sure, but wanting to start, of course, with the actual Hebrew Bible's claims about what a Messiah will be, will look like, time frames, all of that stuff. So yeah, whichever one you think is best for us to start with, let's dive in.
I agree. So I want to, like you said, kind of paint a picture of like, what were they expecting, and then how are the New Testament authors interpreting the data in front of them? Like, if they're looking back at the same passages we're looking at, how do they get from point A to point B? Because, like, when I read those chapters, I don't get the same conclusion, right? So how did they get that conclusion?
Right.
So we definitely want to take a look at that. But in Jeremiah 33, verses 14 all the way through 18, there's just this delightful passage. It gets somewhat repeated in Jeremiah chapter 23. But it says, "The days are surely coming, says the Lord, when I will fulfill the promise that I made to the house of Israel and to the house of Judah. In those days and at that time, I will cause a righteous branch to spring up for David, and he shall execute justice and righteousness in the land. In those days, Judah will be saved, and Jerusalem will live in safety. And this is the name by which it will be called, the Lord is our righteousness." And so we'll save the last two verses just for a second. You might be asking yourself, well, what's the promise that he's going to fulfill? Like, he just says he's going to fulfill the promise. Well, he kind of built that promise up in the preceding verses. He kind of tells you that it's a renewal of the land where people are going to live in the towns of the hill country. They're going to live in the Shephelah, in the Negev, and they're going to pasture their flocks in Judah and Benjamin again, and they're going to do so safely, right? They're not going to be in fear. So when it says that this is the promise that he's going to fulfill, clearly, it must include the conclusion of them living safely. That's why it says Judah will be saved and Jerusalem will live safely. Now, if Jesus didn't do that, then he certainly didn't fulfill this prophecy. And if you just stop at verse 16, you might be inclined to think, well, he'll do that when he comes back. Obviously, the stuff that is clearly about the Messiah is the stuff that's always going to happen when he comes back. But the problem is, if you just read the next two verses, it's clear that even when he comes back, he's not doing the stuff. Because in 17 and 18, it says, "For thus saith the Lord, David shall never lack a man to sit on the throne of the house of Israel, and the Levitical priest shall never lack a man in my presence to offer burnt offerings, to make grain offerings, and to make sacrifices for all time." So, listen, we got a serious problem, because Hebrews chapter 7 says that Jesus put an end to these sacrifices. In fact, Paul himself says that they're no longer even bound to the law. And so this idea that we're going to have Levitical sacrifices forever, that doesn't tie with the New Testament at all. And you might be thinking, well, maybe this is an outlier. But no, it's certainly not an outlier, because if you go to Ezekiel chapter 40 and beyond, when it talks about the new temple and the new Jerusalem and this Messiah prince who's going to come, there's a whole chapter dedicated to the actual sacrifices and offerings that they're going to give. He names the animals, when you're going to give them, what times of the year are you going to slaughter the animals for these sacrifices, and even dictates that the prince, the Messiah, who's leading the people, are going to participate in the offerings and sacrifices over the house of Israel. So this idea that the Messiah's going to come and he's going to do away with these offerings, he's going to do away with the law of Moses, that simply doesn't exist in the Hebrew Scriptures. It's not there.
It's almost so opposite. Like, Jesus breaks the idea so hard that it kind of stopped me. It was like, am I just missing something entirely? Like, how did Christianity possibly jump off from this and ever even try to make the claim that Jesus is doing any of this? And I think this first one, this Davidic king, is such a good example of that, and the chain that is broken that shouldn't have been broken, and the reversal of the sacrifice practice and things of this nature. Do you think that this is our best evidence that Jesus doesn't fit the mold, or is it a combination of things?
God damn it.
Well, if you just want one proof text, this might be your best proof text, and I go to it a lot, but there's a lot of them actually, and there's a lot of them that talk about this messianic age without even mentioning the Messiah. We can go to like Isaiah 56, where it talks about how the foreigners are going to come to worship Yahweh, right? The foreigners that joined themselves to Israel. And what's it say about them? There's an interesting quote in Isaiah 56 that shows up when Jesus cleanses the temple. And remember, it says that my house would be a house of prayer for all people. Well, this is a quotation from Isaiah 56. In fact, it says in verse 3, "Do not let the foreigner joined to the Lord say that the Lord will surely separate me from his people." So we got this idea that the foreigners are coming to worship Yahweh, right? So what's going to happen when these foreigners come to worship Yahweh? Well, he tells you in verse 6, "The foreigners who join themselves to the Lord to minister to him, to love the name of the Lord, and to be his servants, all who keep the Sabbath and do not profane it and hold fast to my covenant, these I will bring to my holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer. their burnt offerings and their sacrifices will be accepted on my altar, for my house will be called a house of prayer for all people. So this idea that the house of the Lord is going to be for all people includes those people bringing burnt offerings. It's a difficult thing to get out of, and you might ask yourself, okay, but they don't have to follow all the laws. Well, it clearly says so. They're going to hold fast to the Sabbaths and to the covenant. And this gets picked up in Ezekiel 44. This idea that, no, the foreigners don't get to abrogate the law of Moses. In fact, in verse 9 of Ezekiel 4, it says, "Thus saith the Lord God, no foreigner, uncircumcised in the heart or the flesh, of all the foreigners who are among the people of Israel, shall enter my sanctuary." So according to Ezekiel, you got to snip the tip. Whether you're an Israelite or whether you're a foreigner, you got to take care of that. So again, we have all this data from the Old Testament that talks about what to expect during the Messianic age, and it just doesn't seem to line up with what we know about Christianity. And this other idea that there's going to be peace, we touched on that with Jeremiah 33. There's supposed to be this era of peace. Well, Micah leans really hard into this. Micah has a section of chapter 4 dedicated to this, which he is actually quoting from Isaiah chapter 2, which is interesting because the book of Matthew tries to paint this idea that Jesus actually is the fulfillment of Isaiah chapter 2. You've probably heard the prophecy where it says that he moved to the town of Nazareth because it was said that he would be a Nazarene. Mm-hmm. And this is really a play on words from Isaiah chapter 2, where it says, actually Isaiah chapter 11, I apologize, where it says that a branch will come out from the root of Jesse, right? It says, a shoot will come out from the stump of Jesse, a branch will grow out of his roots. And branch in Hebrew is netzer, which just means a branch, but it sounds like Nazareth if you just knock off the final letter. And so Matthew's doing a little bit of a play on words here, but if you read Isaiah chapter 11, it's adorable that you think he's the branch, but the problem is nothing happened. Chapter 11 says, the wolf will lie down with the lamb, the leopard will lie down with the kid, the calf and the lion will feed together, the little children will lead them, the cow and the bear will graze together. Holy smokes, we got all kinds of stuff that seems to be like world peace. It said, they will not hurt or destroy on my holy mountain, for the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord, as the water covers the sea. How can you tell me that Jesus is a fulfillment of Isaiah chapter 11 just because he moved to a town that sounds vaguely similar to a word that happened to show up in the passage?
This is why it's so important. And
let me hear that again.
It's frustrating because as a believer, you're told...
Problem is, in Hebrew is netzer, which just means a branch, but it's of Nazareth because it was said that he would be a Nazarene. And this is really a play on words from Isaiah chapter 2, where it says, actually Isaiah chapter 11, I apologize, where it says that a branch will come out from the root of Jesse, right? It says, a shoot will come out from the stump of Jesse, a branch will grow out of his roots. And branch in Hebrew is netzer, which just means a branch, but it sounds like Nazareth if you just knock off the final letter. And so Matthew's doing a little bit of a play on words here, but if you read Isaiah chapter 11, it's adorable that he's, which just means a branch, but it sounds like Nazareth if you just knock off the final letter. And so Matthew's doing a little bit of a play on words here, but if you read Isaiah chapter 11, it's adorable that you think he's the branch, but the problem is nothing happened. Chapter 11 says, the wolf will lie down with the lamb, the leopard will lie down with the kid, the calf and the lion will feed together, the little children will lead them, the cow and the bear will graze together. Holy smokes, we got all kinds of stuff that seems to be like world peace. It said, they will not hurt or destroy on my holy mountain, for the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord, as the water covers the sea. How can you tell me that Jesus is a fulfillment of Isaiah chapter 11 just because he moved to a town that sounds vaguely similar to a word that happened to show up in the passage?
This is why it's so important, and it's frustrating because as a believer, you're told, and this isn't true for everyone, some people are encouraged much more to dig in and really study their Bible and understand the history and things like this, but your average believer, there are couple billion people that believe Jesus is the Messiah, essentially. And I would say 1.8 billion of them, if we're just throwing a number out there, don't have any understanding in this kind of thing. And they are just reading the New Testament. They're just hearing what their pastor says. And it feels so true with some of the things that get pointed out in retcon, which we'll get to. How do you think, though, again, without getting into the excuses, how do you think that the gospel writers got it so wrong? Were they just hell-bent on making Jesus fit no matter what? Is it just, rose-colored glasses? Or were they bad at reading and understanding? I think a lot of times, especially Christians, will have this idea that, like, these, and not that they would even most of the time call them anonymous gospel authors, would have been experts in their field and had studied the Hebrew Bible so well and knew exactly what prophecies meant what. What's your take on that? What can the person who's deconstructing hear from you about this level of expertise?
Well, I would probably say two things. I think if you just want to ask yourself what level of expertise do they have, look no further than Mark chapter 1 and chapter 2. In just the first two chapters of Mark makes two blunders trying to address the Hebrew Bible. So in Mark chapter 1, famously, when John the Baptist is introduced, it says, "In the beginning was the good news of Jesus Christ, as it is written in the prophet Isaiah." And then he goes on to conflate Malachi with Isaiah. He says, "See, I'm sending my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way," which is from Malachi chapter 3. Then it says, "The voice of the one crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight his path," which is from Isaiah chapter 40. So, like, it seems to me that, like, at Mark, our earliest gospel, if he's an expert, he's got some explaining to do, because he seems to be a little bit confused, and you might just give him a pass and say, well, sometimes people do that, right? They just forget who the quote came from. Because again, in 2:26, he says that Abiathar was the high priest when David went into the priest at Nob, when he was on the run from King Saul. But it wasn't Abiathar, it was Ahimelech. He was the high priest. Abiathar didn't become high priest until Saul already died, and David took over. So, like, Mark has, his understanding of the Hebrew Scriptures seems to be a pretty low level. And this might be one reason why you don't see a lot of Old Testament citations in the book of Mark. You don't see quite as many of them. But that being said, I don't think Matthew is much better, but I think Matthew is doing something that's not completely inventing a new hermeneutic, and it might be a good time to introduce two texts. So I get to talk about them a lot, but I don't often get to read from them because I'm usually in the middle of a debate. But if you got a copy of the Dead Sea Scrolls in English, we can kind of see this thing that was happening within the Jewish communities during what might be referred to as the intertestamental period, the 400 years, leading up to the arrival of the first century. And we've got a whole bunch of Pesharim in the Dead Sea Scrolls, some of them readable, some of them not so readable. And what we find in there is there's like a retooling, a reworking, you would say, of the prophecies, where it seems like the prophecies predicted that, like, after the Babylonian exile, finally God's going to restore his people. And then it seems like they're rebuilding a little bit, but maybe not the way the prophecy expected, so they have to move things out, which is why Daniel is like, hey, listen, I was reading the prophecy of Jeremiah, famously in Daniel chapter 9, and he's trying to figure out, because he's about 522, he's reading this prophecy according to the timeline of Daniel 9, and he's like, after 70 years, according to Jeremiah 25, we should have been restored. It's been longer than 70 years, what gives? And then he's like, well, I was reading the law of Moses, and it turned out, there's these additional punishments in the law of Moses. Now we got a multiplier 70 by 7. So we see even the book of Daniel is like, okay, we have to kind of rework these prophecies to make light of the fact that they didn't really come true. Mm-hmm. And so we find a bunch of that in the Jewish literature. And so if you read the famous Habakkuk Pesher in the Dead Sea Scrolls, you'll find that they go through and they'll go like line by line and they'll like reinterpret what it means. Like it had an original meaning, but like here's what it means now, right? So for example, on Habakkuk 1:6. The quotation is, "For now I am about to rise up the Chaldeans, that brutal, reckless people." Well, we know who the Chaldeans are. That's a very specific people group. These are the Babylonians, right? But in the Pesher, it says this refers to the Katim, who are swift and mighty in their annihilation. Wait a minute. The Katim are people from the west.
Yeah.
The Babylonians didn't come from the west. They came from the northeast. So they're just going through and they're just like, hey, listen, we've got to retool these prophecies to make them relevant to our time period, rather than just admitting that these prophecies aren't real because the people who gave them weren't actually hearing from God. And maybe my favorite one is from the Nahum Pesher. There's a quotation from Nahum 2:11 where it says, "Wherever the lion goes, there also goes the whelp without fear." And there's this really interesting chapter in chapter 2 of Nahum where God is pronouncing judgment on Nineveh, right? And but the Pesher sees it differently. The Pesher says this actually refers to Demetrius, the king of Greece, who sought to enter Jerusalem. Like, wait a minute. These are condemnations for the enemies of Israel. I mean, the Babylonians at the time, not the Greeks. So this is kind of what we see happening in the New Testament, where they're willing to say, these prophecies can't fail, which means we have to retool them. We have to go in and say, well, these words actually don't mean what the words originally meant. They have to mean something new. And I think the biggest tool that the New Testament uses is this idea of like, well, it was fulfilled, but it was fulfilled spiritually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely the biggest one for sure. It's the biggest excuse. I want to break that one down with you for sure. I also want to say it's so refreshing to hear someone so knowledgeable and so text heavy. And so for those of you listening or watching, I hope that you embrace this for what it is. This is, you're getting the text, you're getting the references. It is truly, I mean, I'm excited. I've got the same copy of the disc. As soon as we get off, like, I'm going to go grab it and highlight what you mentioned, because it's so interesting to me and I want to see it and understand it for myself. And so I just want to encourage everybody. I'll list the resources of any book or text that we mention in the description down below, and take time with this one, follow along, see it for yourself, especially if you're in that doubting or deconstructing phase, because even though it was the last for me, if you can wrap your head around this, about truly how much Jesus does not meet the standard, how the standard has changed, how the standard has to get manipulated to try to fit things in, and like the examples you're giving, it's not just Christians 2,000 years later that are doing it. It's not just our New Testament writers that did it. As long as there have been prophecies that didn't seem like they're working out, there's been goalpost moving. There's been shifting and changing. And in a million years, I don't think I would have heard those two examples. So again, I'm having like a geek moment of thrill with you here that you're bringing stuff like that up. So I just wanted to kind of just level set really quick with that.
Yeah, and so maybe now would be a good time to kind of look at how the New Testament authors were retooling some of these prophecies, or at least trying to figure out, like, you know, how can we make these seem like they're more about Jesus? Like one of the more famous ones, but I think it kind of paints a clear picture of what type of hermeneutic they were working with, is the virgin birth in Isaiah 7. Such a famous passage. It's a great place to start because so many people know about it. But if you just read the New Testament, like Matthew has this idea in chapter 1, I believe, verse 23, where he's saying, like, this is happening to fulfill what was written in the Scriptures, you know, and then he quotes from the Greek edition of the Old Testament. And so you might just be inclined to think, like, listen, if I go to the Old Testament, I should find a prophecy about a Messiah being born of a virgin. It should just be there. That's kind of how Matthew is interpreting it. But
and saying as much. I mean, again, Matthew, more than any of the gospel writers, I believe, is the one that keeps adding on so that it fulfills the prophecy, or to point to the prophecy that's fulfilled.
That's it. Yeah. Matthew really wants to tie Jesus to the messianic expectation from the Hebrew Bible, because he knows that there's a sense of authority there that you need to tap into. And so he's trying to tap into it. John does a little bit. I think John's got about 6 different prophecies he lists. Matthew has well over 20. Luke and Mark, they're not so concerned about that. I mean, both of them most likely were writing to a Greco-Roman audience. John, it's hard to tell John says a lot of things. He keeps referring to the Jews as though he's not one of them, which makes you wonder, like, who does he have any Jewish people in his audience? Because he's going to alienate them with the way he's talking. But Matthew seems to be trying to straddle that fence. He seems to be. He's not painting the Jews in a good light, and we don't have a ton of time to spend on that topic, but he's also not alienating them at the same time. But anyway, so in Matthew 1:23 it says, "Look, the virgin shall become pregnant and give birth to a son, and they shall name him Emmanuel," which there's a couple problems on the face of this, because even in the Greek version it doesn't say "they shall name him." He has to change it to a "they" to make it sound like the people in general are going to refer to him as Emmanuel. That's a small change that he puts in there to make it sound like it's more about Jesus. But if you just go back to chapter 7 of Isaiah, ask the question, what's the context? What's actually happening here? Let's not read the one verse that was quoted. Well, at the beginning of Isaiah chapter 7, it's clear there's a war. The war is between the northern tribes of Israel and the Arameans. They formed an alliance as King Pekah and King Rezin, and they're fighting against King Ahaz in Judah. They want to replace him. They want to put somebody on the throne who's more favorable to their alliance. And God not only doesn't like this, but he's also worried about Ahaz losing faith. Because it says in verse 2, when the house of David heard that Aram had allied itself with Ephraim, the heart of Ahaz and the heart of his people shook as the trees shake before the wind. So he's like, listen, don't give up. You gotta be strong here. You gotta hold on. And so he sends the prophet Isaiah to the washer's field, and he has a clandestine meeting with the king, and the end of the prophecy ends with, "If you do not stand firm in faith, you shall not stand at all." And that's really what the prophecy is about, is this is going to be okay, God's got you, right? And then you get to the second visitation by Isaiah, and this is where the prophecy turns up. And it says, "Again the Lord spoke to Ahaz, saying, Ask a sign of the Lord your God, and let it be as deep as Sheol or as high as heaven. But Ahaz said, I will not ask, and I will not put the Lord to the test. Then Isaiah said, Hear then, O house of David, is it too little for you to weary mortals, and you weary my God also? Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Look, the young woman is with child, and shall bear a son, and shall name him Emmanuel." And this, people kind of stop reading there, but it's really important to read the next two verses. It says, "He shall eat curds and honey by the time he knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good. For before the child knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land before whose two kings you are in dread will be deserted." So, contextually speaking, it's actually about a child who's already been conceived. What we have here is, in Hebrew, is ha'alma, which just means the young woman. It could be interpreted that Alma could be a virgin that is not outside the realm of possibilities, but certainly it doesn't make sense of the passage. People kind of stop reading there, but it's really important to read the next two verses. It says, "He shall eat curds and honey by the time he knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good. For before the child knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land before whose two kings you are in dread will be deserted." So, contextually speaking, it's actually about a child who's already been conceived. What we have here is, in Hebrew, is ha'alma, which just means the young woman. It could be interpreted that Alma could be a virgin that is not outside the realm of possibilities, but certainly it doesn't make sense of the passage. It also uses the adjective hara, which just means pregnant. It's an adjective in this form. If it was being used as a verb, it wouldn't be able to work for the sentence because it's past tense and it's in the masculine form. So it's clearly an adjective describing a pregnant young woman who's about to give birth, and before that child knows right from wrong, the two kings that King what we have here is, in Hebrew, is ha'alma, which just means the young woman. It could be interpreted that Alma could be a virgin that is not outside the realm of possibilities, but certainly it doesn't make sense of the passage. It also uses the adjective hara, which just means pregnant. It's an adjective in this form. If it was being used as a verb, it wouldn't be able to work for the sentence because it's past tense and it's in the masculine form. So it's clearly an adjective describing a pregnant young woman who's about to give birth, and before that child knows right from wrong, the two kings that King Ahaz is afraid of, they're going to get wiped out. They're going to get wiped out by the king of Assyria. And I think the prophecy makes a lot of sense because, remember, God is trying to shore up the faith of the people so that they won't fall. And as the prophecy comes true in chapter 8, as it's happening, the prophet cries out twice. He says, O Emmanuel, take notice, all you people, and be dismayed. Listen, all you far-off countries, gird yourselves and be dismayed. Take counsel together, but it shall be brought to naught. Speak a word, and it shall not stand, for God is with us. So the prophecy doesn't say anything about a Messiah. It's not anything for hundreds of years later. It's a prophecy about the current time, 725, 730 years before Jesus, and it has nothing to do with Jesus. But the New Testament authors need to find something to describe Jesus. And they're like, we already have this young woman with no father, and it's obviously got to be a virgin birth. That rumor must have started. It must have been popular enough by the time the gospel authors were writing that was already part of the zeitgeist of Jesus. They already knew that he didn't have a father, so he must have been from God, just like the other Roman demigods. He was part human and part God.
Kiss it!
So interesting to connect all the little details, because I think people that have been in this space long enough, they hear, Alma, is actually the Septuagint got it wrong, and it means young lady. It can mean virgin, but obviously the gospel writers took it and used it incorrectly to force this point, which, if said just that plainly, opens the door to a lot of Christian apologetics. But when you do what Christians say we're supposed to do, and you really get into the context, and you really get into the original language and the meaning and the culture and the events of the day, I don't see how it can possibly be reconciled. And then the second thing that you said there that's so interesting to me is that, and I think a lot of people don't think this, I know I didn't when I was still a believer, we think of the stories originating with the gospel writers as opposed to what you're talking about, this cultural zeitgeist going on, these rumors that have been going on for decades, if not more in some cases.
Stalin! I ain't talking Joseph
putting
Stalin
down
either.
The paper as opposed to generating the story. And it's almost like they're a slave to their audience at that point. Some audience capture going on, having to feed them in an official manner what they had so often heard and already believed to add validity. And it just makes it, to me, again, when I hear it spelled out so well, thank you, so obviously human, so flawed. The things we do all the time, no one is immune from this kind of thinking or this kind of, playing around with text or history to arrive at the and it just takes the writers and the spiritual aspect of it, if anything could exist, off that pedestal, and it just shows how real it is. So excellent explanation on that one particular thing that I think a lot of us take for granted, like, oh yeah, that's an issue. It's a huge issue. It's unbelievable. But I'll shut up. It's just fascinating to hear it all put together.
And it seems like early on in the ministry there must have been a lot of, I don't want to use the words rumors, but there must have been a lot of chat about his origin. Right? Because we've got other rumors from early writers and whatnot and early minds who are of the opinion that, Mary just cheated on Joseph. And then this actually explains the flight into Egypt, which I think we'll definitely touch on next. But if it's true, like if Jesus was a real person, and I know there's a lot of mythicists out there that hate me because they don't like that I think he was a real person, but like if he was a real person, and we don't assume that the Roman government for some reason made this person up, then it actually makes a lot of sense because people were like having disagreements about his origin, why there was no father, and what his character was all about. And so one of the early voices you might have read Contra Celsum, which is the disputation between Origen and Celsus. And Celsus actually is tapping into a viewpoint that was pretty common at the time, which is that no, he's not the son of God. He wasn't born of a virgin. his wife Mary was betrothed and cheated on Joseph. And because of that, then they had to go to Egypt to escape persecution. He says, hence, in the consequence of being expelled by her husband, becoming an ignominious vagabond, she was secretly delivered of Jesus, who, through poverty, being obliged to serve as a hireling in Egypt, learnt there the arts for which the Egyptians are famous. Afterwards, returning from thence, he thought so highly of himself, on account of the possession of these magical arts, as to proclaim himself to be a god. And so here we have actually what I would say it sounds like a way more plausible argument for the narrative around Jesus.
Almost anything is a more plausible argument than just jumping to virgin births. So, low bar, but yes, for sure. Lots of different potential explanations. And while we're on that, the Egypt narrative, of course, another gospel claim is out of Egypt, which we can talk either about the contradiction between how Jesus was in these places according to the different gospel accounts, but more specifically, I would like to hear from your mouth in the same way that we covered Luke's young woman or virgin claim. What verse in the Old Testament are they trying to line this up with, and what is the validity there?
Right. So Matthew chapter 2, about verse 14 through 16, it said that Joseph and Mary got up and took the boy by night to Egypt and fled there to avoid the persecution by Herod and stayed there until his death. And this was to fulfill what was spoken by the Lord through the prophets. Out of Egypt I have called my son. And this is a famous passage. Where, obviously, this is about the Messiah coming out of Egypt. But if you go to the citation from Hosea chapter 11, which is where it comes from, it's actually not clear at all that's what's happening. In fact, what's being cited is not really even a prophecy, at least not the part that they're citing. So, for example, the first 4 verses of Hosea chapter 11 are not prophetic. They're actually retelling a history. There is a prophecy that begins in verse 5, and it'll make more...
Can I stop you really quick? I'm sure there's people who are not used to reading these texts at all. When and how are you differentiating between what is prophetic and what's not, and when it shifts? It seems like a lot of these books obviously are jumping in and out. What is the distinction? What should one be looking for to better understand the context?
Well, I think the way to understand a prophecy in the Hebrew Bible is something that the Lord is speaking, either through a prophet or through somebody that he's given utterance, and is revealing either information that wouldn't otherwise be known, or is revealing information about the future, or sometimes bringing condemnation, like when Nathan went to condemn David for sleeping with Bathsheba. He brought a word about the past and said, hey, I know about this. I saw what happened. But he's also then giving a prophecy about the punishment for the future. So it can be a little bit of a mix, but you know that a prophecy is a prophecy because it's something that you can recognize as a prophecy. And I think the best proof for this is in Deuteronomy 18. There's a section in Deuteronomy 18 where it's saying that a prophet like Moses is going to come. And there's obviously some open dialogue. Well, how do we know that a word being spoken is from a prophet or not, right? And it says, any prophet who presumes to speak in my name a word that I have not commanded the prophet to speak, or who speaks in the name of other gods, that prophet shall die. And you may say to yourself, how can we recognize a word that the Lord has not spoken? If a prophet speaks in the name of the Lord, but the thing does not take place or prove true, it is a word that the Lord has not spoken. The prophet has spoken presumptuously, and do not be frightened by it. So there seems to be this idea that, a prophecy is something spoken by the Lord that you should be testing. You should know it's a prophecy off the bat. It shouldn't be a secret.
No, that's good. I know it sounds like a bit of a juvenile question, but for those that would go to their church leader and say, hey, what about this prophecy? It clearly didn't happen. So often there's so much pushback that you're reading it wrong, or it wasn't for that time, or actually that's just a what if, or that was a historical possibility, or that was an event, but it was described differently in special terms. And so, if anything, I just want to be able to empower people to no, if something is said to happen and it's coming from God or through the prophets, you should be able to test these things. And it's not testing God. It is the system in which God set this up, supposedly, for us to know certain things. Of course, there's many verses that allow you to back right out of that, where you can have false prophets, and sometimes it's because they were wicked, but sometimes it's because God gave them that word, and it's, nothing is ever simple, but that's a good explanation. Thank you. I'll let you get back to what you were saying.
Yeah, the only other thing I would point people towards is maybe Deuteronomy 13, where it talks about false prophets coming and making omens and portents for the future and saying, hey, if they don't come true, if they do come true, don't listen to that prophet. I'm testing you, right? So even in Deuteronomy 13, there's this idea that like the prophecy is going to be something that you need to test. Even if it comes true, it may not actually be from the Lord, but it's not just any random words on a page.
Right.
So in Hosea 11, we find the fulfillment, supposedly, of Matthew chapter 2, verses 14 through 16. And it says, when Israel was a child, I loved him. And out of Egypt I called my son. And now, if you're a Christian, you might stop reading there, but you shouldn't stop reading there. Because it says, the more that I called them, the more that they went from me. And they kept sacrificing to the Baals and offering incense to the idols. Yet it was I who taught Ephraim to walk, and I took them up in my arms, but they did not know that I healed them. So he's talking about the Exodus, right? Anyone reading this is like, oh yeah, this is just a retelling of the Exodus, right? There's no prophecy to be had here, at least not until verse number 5. And you might be asking yourself, why the change? Why the change from history to prophecy? Well, it's actually quite clear. God is actually building a case in which to condemn Israel. It says, I led them with cords of human kindness, with bands of love. I was to them like those who lift infants to their cheeks. I bent down to feed them and fed them, and they shall return to the land of Egypt, and Assyria will be their king because they have refused to return to me. So the prophecy legitimately starts in verse 5. Prior to that, God's giving you the groundwork for this is why bad things are about to happen to you. I brought you out of Egypt. I fathered you. I put you in my arms. And you rebelled against me the entire way. You were my firstborn son, and I loved you. And because of your constant rebellion, I have to send you back into captivity. So once you put the appropriate framing around it, like there's no Messiah here to be had. There's no Messiah coming out of Egypt. And the part that was quoted from is literally a passage that is trying to be used by the author to condemn the nation of Israel, not to save them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exact opposite. Once again, it's just amazing that this stuff ever got through. It's just so pervasive.
It's hard to believe. I think part of the problem is in today's world, we can pick up a Bible, right? We can just go grab a Bible and pick it up and like, is that really in there? Did it really say that? You don't really have that access to written literature in the ancient world, and there's so much that was word of mouth, or you would go to your friend that just knew a little bit more than you did.
Damn it.
So, like, remember when computers were still new, and like, so I'm an elder millennial. I remember I was just old enough that like I knew how computers worked, and like when Grandma had a problem, I would fix Grandma's computer. But like that didn't make me a computer expert, right?
Yeah.
But unfortunately, religious literature is much the same in the ancient world. Like sometimes you just had to find someone who knew a little bit more than you did to ask the question, but often they weren't great resources.
Yeah, again, the human factor of it, which for so many people is so hard to let go. I don't know how much you know of my personal story. I had a good decade not in fundamentalism, but I had a long life before then of very fundamentalists. The Bible is inerrant. And so ideas like that the reason we have certain mistakes, sometimes it's not even manipulation or someone trying to lie and create this thing to deceive. It is just that people were fallible and didn't have a lot of information, which is not what you would expect, of course, when you're thinking that all Scripture is inspired to this degree and that God had a special hand in every single author, over the course of the centuries who put this thing together. And so I always try to keep that in mind as I'm speaking to people who are deconstructing. There's two types of these deconstructions: the leave from fundamentalism and the Bible being inerrant, but then that even that doesn't just make it okay and get excused. You still have major issues, even in a proper understanding of the Bible and interpretation and things of this nature. So I'm just trying to hit on both sides of that coin. But yeah, very, very true point.
Yeah, and I was a Christian for a while that didn't hold the biblical inerrancy, and certainly you can do that. You can be a Bible believer and not believe that it's inerrant.
Yeah, I made it work for a while.
Yeah, right. I think a lot of us try. Like, you hang on to every little bit you think you can, and eventually, towards the end of it, you're kind of like, I don't think there's anything left to hold on to. But so that's the process. I think for me, once I realized the prophecies were so problematic, it was hard for me to call myself a Christian, because I was like, when I first started digging into them, I was like, okay, I can see why that one's kind of nonsense. That's silly, But then as I really got to know them well, I was like, I don't think you filled any of these. Like, none of these prophecies, not even the ones that are like legitimate prophecies. Like Micah 5 is a legitimate prophecy. It's not like just picking random words and calling it a prophecy. Like Hosea chapter 11 it says, "But you, O Bethlehem of Ephrathah, who are of the little clans of Judah, from you will come forth for me one who is to rule in Israel, whose origin is from old, from ancient days." Well, this is the justification given by the wise men as to Jesus' birthplace being in Bethlehem. So that seems to be a legitimate prophecy, but all you have to do is just read it carefully and slowly. And it becomes clear that it couldn't be about Jesus. Because it says, "From you will come forth for me one who is to rule in Israel." Okay, well, first of all, Jesus didn't rule in Israel. Second of all, the narrative clues you into the first problem, which is that they're asking where's going to be the birthplace of the new king. But Jesus is never a king. This is a huge problem. And you might ask yourself, okay, but like, he will be the king when he comes back. He will rule when he comes back. But he didn't come back, which means he didn't fulfill the prophecy. Like, anytime you seed a prophecy and say, well, he'll do it later, well, that's an admission that he didn't do it yet, which means it's not fulfilled. You don't get to claim that as a fulfilled prophecy.
Yeah, you can't have it both ways. And I think a question I would have for you, just from your level of expertise, is, because I've heard both, and I just don't know the literature well enough. For the people at the time that these Old Testament texts are being first, either orally passed down or finally put down pen to paper, would there have ever been an expectation that a prophecy is going to take 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years to be fulfilled? Or was it always kind of an immediate, this lifetime maybe, or this generation maybe later? Do we have context around that?
God fucking
a little bit. So there's a passage in Zephaniah and a passage in Ezekiel that seems to be suggesting that these prophecies are coming soon. So Ezekiel is questioning, why the prophecies seem to be tarrying. And the Lord says, from here on out, these prophecies are going to be imminent, right? And then Zephaniah is, not a lot of people get into Zephaniah, but it's an interesting prophecy about the supposed day of the Lord when he finally brings like the final reckoning of things. And Zephaniah says, it's now. He says that day is at hand. And so we have this idea that like these prophecies seem to be pretty darn immediate. And if they weren't immediate, well, it's kind of silly that God is framing them as though they're about to happen to these people. When they don't come true, what do? Well, you have to say, well, I mean, obviously the prophecy had to be reworked, or it was conditional, right? The Israelites repented, so God didn't bring the destruction. Look at what God said he was going to do to Nineveh. And they repented, and God didn't destroy them, right? So you get a lot of wiggling with people when they don't come true to make up like different reasons why they didn't come true. But what you don't get, you never get a statement from God later in the Bible that says why it didn't come true.
Right, because the intention is that it was going to. Yeah, the goalpost moving is so very obvious and serious. And like you said, sometimes it works out, but you usually get a conclusion within that specific time frame. Like the Nineveh story is a perfect example of that. Sorry, I'll let you pick up where you were.
No, I mean, it's a great question, and it seems to be that way even in the prophecies. So, for example, when you go to Isaiah chapter 40, which gets quoted in Mark when it says, prepare the way, right? This is in reference to Jesus. But, like, if you're reading Isaiah 40, it's actually pretty clear that this is about, like, roughly 539 538 BCE is the time period they're expecting this to come true, right? So this is being written as basically they're being freed from captivity, or maybe just before it. Maybe King Cyrus is marching into the empire ready to destroy it, right? And the prophecy says, comfort O comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and cry to her that she has served her term and paid her penalty. She received from the Lord's hand double for her sin. So everything in Isaiah 40 to chapter 55 is to the Israelites in captivity and those that remained in Jerusalem, talking about how they're going to return to the land, they're going to be completely restored, and that Yahweh is going to dwell with them, which is why you get verse 3, a voice cries out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, and make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley will be lifted up and every mountain will be made low. And so there's this idea that, hey, the Israelites are returning to Jerusalem, and guess what? So is God. God's returning to the temple. He's going to dwell in the temple again and be with his people. And so we have this beautiful chapter about how there's this prediction that finally, your hard times are over. Like, you're done. You can take a deep breath finally, right? And then obviously it didn't come true. And so you have to ask yourself, like, how in the world could this have been fulfilled in Jesus? Because the prophecy, like, if you actually care about the context of the prophecy is about Yahweh himself coming and dwelling in the temple, in the midst of the people. And that certainly didn't happen. In fact, the temple was destroyed in 70.
Which people will credit as fulfilled prophecy, actually.
Right.
So I do want to talk about that one, because that's some of that is, I want to get in at some point here to the prophecies from Jesus himself that you either have to move to a spiritual fulfillment or not. But before we do, I want to kind of recap Old Testament ideas of the Messiah, because we started there and we pretty quickly moved into the New Testament. The first one, the Davidic king, the idea of a true king, a ruler in general. Of course, the peace aspect, and that's brought up a lot. It's not a singular instance. There are many, many verses that reference this, where the time has come to put the sword down and go back to harvesting, I think, or plowing, something like that.
Yep.
Aside from those two main, the kingship, the ruling, the peace, are there any other expectations as we round out the picture of this shadow figure of what a Messiah should look like besides those? What else?
Well, there is kind of this expectation that he's going to defeat the enemies. It's not just that he's going to be a king. It's not just that he's going to sit on the throne over a time of peace, but he's actually going to be defeating the enemies. He
makes the peace. It didn't just happen because he showed up. It happened through conquering. Is that fair to say?
That's right. In fact, Isaiah says he will smite the wicked with the breath of his mouth. He's going to kill all the wicked just with the breath of his mouth. And even in Micah 5, we briefly quoted Micah 5, but in Micah 5, there's an interesting passage, if you keep reading a little bit. It says about the rescue. It says, he will stand and feed his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God. Which is funny, because this person has a God, and it's Yahweh, so it can't be Yahweh himself. It says, they will live secure. For now, he shall be to the ends of the earth. He will be the one of peace. Well, the one of peace is described in chapter 4 when it says they're going to beat their swords into plowshares. And it says, if the Assyrians come into our land and tread upon our soil, we will rise against them with 7 shepherds, so on and so forth. And talks about this time period where this ruler is going to be coming, right? And it's very clear from Micah chapter 5, one more element that we didn't really touch on yet. But Micah chapter 5, verse 2 says, but you, O Bethlehem of Ephrathah. That's a very curious phrase, because a lot of people know what Bethlehem's all about, but what in the world is Ephrathah? Well, Bethlehem and Ephrath are the two oldest ancestors of King David. If you go to the book of Chronicles, you'll find the lineage of these people, and Bethlehem and Ephrathah are named after these two individuals. So these two individuals probably are being referenced here as a lineage more than it is a territory. They're more concerned about the lineage of this person than they are with the physical location, which is why it says, whose origin is from old, from ancient days. The origin of this character is from the ancient line of David. That's what's being expressed here in Micah 5 too. And so you might say to yourself, well, shit, Jesus, he came from the line of David, did he not? Unfortunately, it seems that he did not. In Matthew chapter 1, we get a genealogy of Jesus that goes all the way to Joseph, who famously wasn't the father of Jesus. There's another problem with the lineage in Matthew. You'll find in the lineage of Matthew, there's a guy named Jeconiah in verse 12. It says, after the deportation to Babylon, Jeconiah, the father of Salathiel, and Salathiel, the father of Zerubbabel, so on and so forth. Well, the problem with Jeconiah is it's said in Jeremiah 22, verse 30. If you go to Jeremiah 22, we find that Jeconiah wasn't actually a good guy. He's a bad guy. And he had a curse placed on him. Says, thus saith the Lord, record this man as childless, a man who will not succeed in his days, for none of his offspring shall succeed in sitting on the throne of David and ruling again in Judah. Which means, if you came from the line of Jeconiah, you're kind of disqualified right off the bat. Like, it just doesn't work. The other thing in Matthew, which is a little bit unexpected, is this idea that, well, if the line goes all the way to Joseph, and not a lot of people really know this Joseph character. He doesn't really show up a lot in the Gospels. Like after the birth, he kind of disappears. And Christian history did a lot of things, filling in this backstory why he disappeared. And they, because he was older, and he passed away of natural causes, because he was so much older than Mary, so on and so forth. But like, we've got two problems. So first of all, the actual father of Jesus isn't the real father; he's adopted, and that seems to me like you're saying he's from David on a technicality. Like that's crazy to me that you would think that he's from the line of David, but only if you think that adoption is a good way to do it. Now, if Jeconiah's curse wasn't bad enough, you might say, well, yeah, but Luke gives a genealogy, and Luke traces it through Mary. And so because he came through Mary, it's okay, because certainly she could count. But as it turns out, it doesn't go through Mary. This is a very misquoted idea about the genealogy of Luke. It says in 23, in verse 3 of Luke, Jesus was about 30 years old when he began his work. He was the son, as was thought, of Joseph, son of Heli, son of Mathat. And even in early works, like if you read the works of Eusebius deals with the fact that both of these lines go to Joseph, but Joseph has two different fathers. And so even the early church knew this was not about Mary. Mary has nothing to do with these genealogies. But there's actually kind of a problem that we find in the genealogy of Luke, and I don't think it gets talked about nearly enough, which is that the genealogy of Luke goes through the son of David named Nathan. Nathan doesn't get a whole lot of fanfare in the Old Testament in terms of being a Davidic son. But the problem is, when you go back to the promise of the Davidic throne from Yahweh, it's very clear that the throne is not going through Nathan, it's going through Solomon. So this is another problem. And again, you've got to deal with the fact that Mary was from the tribe of Levi, so we have no bloodline going back to David. None.
It's almost hard to say which one of those like seven things is the biggest issue for Jesus' lineage. The fact that some people
back to David.
Hey, wait.
So this is the genealogy of Luke goes through the son of David named Nathan. Nathan doesn't get a whole lot of fanfare in the Old Testament in terms of being a Davidic son. But the problem is, when you go back to the promise of the Davidic throne from Yahweh, it's very clear that the throne is not going through Nathan, it's going through Solomon. So this is another problem. And again, you've got to deal with the fact that Mary was from the tribe of Levi, so we have no bloodline going back to David. None.
It's almost hard to say which one of those like 7 things is the biggest issue for Jesus's lineage. The fact that some people try
to David, none. Tribe of Levi, so we've got to deal with the fact that Mary was from the tribe of Levi, so we have no bloodline going back to David, none.
It's almost hard to say which one of those like 7 things is the biggest issue for Jesus's lineage. The fact that some people try to claim Mary, which would have been ridiculous for ascribing that much power to the female side anyways, let alone the fact that, yeah, her tribe does not line up with David. Then the 2 different fathers, the one that has a curse that no one can reign, then the one that obviously doesn't come from Solomon. It's just, again, it will never not amaze me what Christianity has been able to do. And sometimes, even though I don't claim to be a Christian, of course, anymore, I almost feel embarrassed. Like, what must those Jewish people be thinking about how gullible and dumb and twisted all these Christians have to be to try to make these things work? It's funny, I heard, I think it was Matt Dillon do one time, who was asked, if you had to pick a religion that you think, any world religion is, the best chance at being true, and he says Judaism. Not even like just picking some different Eastern religion or anything like that. It's, no, if you just leave it alone on its own, it's awful, but it's at least a bit more consistent before you have to start playing all of the games. And I thought that was a really good answer, because it does just continue to show how silly Christianity has had to be to try to take credit for what didn't happen, couldn't have happened, wouldn't make sense if it did happen. So that's just Jesus' lineage. This is one small part that is trying to work within greater prophecies about where the Messiah will come from. Fantastic. Was there anything else on his lineage that you wanted to say before we move on?
I think we could say more, but I don't want to get bogged down in lineages because people's eyes will glaze over.
They shouldn't. This is fascinating. You guys, again, I'm just going to be putting up little smiley faces on the screen. Like, did you hear that? It's and some of this I know, and some of it's kind of a new angle for me, which I'm excited to go spend time with. But yeah, I hear you. Chronicles, lineages, numbers, dates, people. It can be too much. But speaking of this kind of thing, though, I do want to really pick your brain on Isaiah 53, right? We're talking about the things the Messiah is supposed to be, and we're talking about the reframing of the Messiah. This idea of the suffering servant, this idea of Old Testament prophecy being pulled through. When you think of Christmas, when you think of the story, when you think of the nativity, etc., you can't get away from this with Christians. And I really want to hear your take on Isaiah 53.
Yeah, so I still remember the time that I sat down as it was like the summer I was going into Bible college. So I went to 2 years of Bible college before seminary, and I had a good friend of mine who already graduated from Bible college, and she turned me on to this idea that the New Testament was doing funny things with the prophecies. And I remember sitting down and saying, okay, I need to read 2nd Isaiah. I already knew at that time point that 2nd Isaiah was a completely different literary unit than chapters 1 through 39, and I was okay with that. So I was like, but I need to read all of 2nd Isaiah, because whoever this author is, he's probably trying to say something. And when I was like struck when I read it, because first of all, it's a beautiful section. It's highly poetic. There's a scholar named John D. Watts, who in his commentary,
smoking hash, cooking meth, selling sex. Smoking hash, cooking meth, selling sex. The children growing up in the street, the kids getting down with the gangs, just like daddy. They're smacking the wife and the kids all around downtown smoking. The children growing up in the streets, the kids getting down with the gangs, just like daddy. They're smacking the wife and the kids all around downtown, smoking hash, cooking meth, selling sex in the crack house together with the parents. They're cutting on the rock, soon getting in the shootout with the cops. Science! You fucking wanna be child molester, you fucking sick son of a bitch. Get some goddamn help.